All right, so I am very blessed and honored to be able to kick off our look at the actual individual commandments. Now, last week we kind of did an overview, we talked about them, but this week we actually get to look at the first three. Before we get to those, though, I want to just start by saying that these commandments, when they were given at Sinai, were nothing new. Now, what do I mean by that? What does it mean that these were not new commandments?
That they had been established in human society, or at least many of them had been established in human society as guidelines to live by.
Okay, so someone here just said, and I'm sorry, what's your name? Drew. Drew just said that these had already been established as guidelines for human society, which I think is interesting and important. A lot of people, when they will talk about the commandments, will bring up the Code of Hammurabi, which predates the law of Israel. And in it, you will find things that sound really similar, like if someone hurts or harms someone, you shall take an eye for an eye. Okay, that sounds really similar. However, I am suggesting that actually we could go back even further. This is something that Terence Fretheim, the late Old Testament scholar, said that I thought just really summarized these commandments beautifully. The law given at Sinai is not a new reality. Sinai is a drawing together of previously known law. In some respects, Sinai is simply a regiving of the law implicitly or explicitly commanded in creation. So back before even humans are on the scene, he's pointing at the law being embedded in God creating the world. So here's what's interesting. Let's think about that. What does that first creation story look like? Anybody want to recap? What does that first creation story look like? What does God do? Okay, in the first creation story, he speaks it into existence. Okay, what does he speak into existence? Everything, okay? I've heard birds, air, light, water, all kinds of stuff. Okay, and then what does he do after he speaks it into existence? Before that, he blesses it and tells it to do what? Go make more of yourself. Go do the thing that I've made you to do. If you're a bird, go fly. If you're a fish, go swim. Okay, so he makes things and he blesses those things, and then he goes on to make other stuff, right? In fact, if any of you have ever traveled to the land of Israel, what I have noticed when I've been there is there are more weddings on Tuesdays than any other day. Now here, we have weddings on Saturdays because that's when everyone has the day off, or most people have the day off. But there, everyone wants to get married on Tuesday because in the first Genesis story, that day has a double blessing. God created the fish and the swarming things and blessed both of them. And so people get married on Tuesday because it's a double blessed day. Yeah. But here's the thing. When God blesses something and tells it to go do its thing, go live your life, make some children, fill the earth and the world and the oceans and the air, it never, by creating the next thing, undoes the blessedness of the creation that comes before it. So he doesn't create the fish and bless them and then create the birds and say, go destroy the fish. So if we think about the way God gave the law, there is something very similar to the way he does creation. In fact, the giving of the law, an act of creation itself, is getting at the same thing. How can we make it so that everything lives and flourishes and multiplies and does what it's supposed to do. And so I think that that's a really beautiful way to see these commandments, not just as rules for human society, but as an act of God's own creating of the world, or recreating the world through the giving of this law. And in fact, because I tend to hang out a little more in the New Testament, I couldn't help but think, we've got a really great New Testament verse. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. So this says that God's nature, what's important to God, what God values, what pleases God, all of that is bound up, and we can see it in creation. And so if we want to understand what the 10 Commandments are doing in the giving of a law, all we really have to do is read it through the lens of, well, what is God doing when he's creating? How is he fitting everything to live in the world? And then we can see that this is the exact same goal for the commandments. How does everything belong and is allowed to flourish? And so my hope is that that also helps us to at least tune ourselves to these not necessarily being prohibitive commandments. Now, many of them have prohibitive language. You shall not kill. That means don't do it. But it's more than that, because the goal of these commandments is life, which we've all lived on this planet long enough to know that there is a difference between living and just not dying. This is getting at the living part. What does it look like for us all to live together in this world God has made and as the people that God has formed? So, without further ado, we can jump into the very first commandment. Oh, sorry, I totally forgot about this slide. We were talking about this being God's nature. This is how the commandments start out, right? We talked about what do we do with this little bit at the beginning that isn't really a commandment? Like, how is this commanding anything? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's not really a commandment. I mean, it's not really telling you to do anything. Or is it? What might this be telling us to do? Well, it's at least telling us what's important to God, that something about God's nature is revealed in this when he says, I am the Lord your God. And do you want to know who I am and what I'm like? I set people free. I bring people out of slavery. I take them out of bondage. That is synonymous with God's nature. So that's another way we can look at these commandments is what, rather than just what are they prohibiting, which we tend to think of as restrictive, what are they limiting us to? Actually, on the other hand, God says, I'm actually a liberating God. My goal for you is for you to live and actually be free and have a full life. So these commandments are not here to restrict you, but rather to give you liberty. That's up to our interpretation to look at, okay, how do these things that we're not supposed to do, like how is not committing adultery giving me liberty? Well, guess what? You are free to love this person. You are free to do what is good for your life, what causes you to flourish, what makes your life full and good. And to look at those things instead of being restrictive and limiting, these are liberating. Later in Exodus, there's this beautiful moment where God is on the mountain with Moses, and Moses wants to see God, right? He wants to see the form of the Lord. And God says, okay, I'll do it, but you can't look that close, and you can only look after I've passed you, and it has to be a rainy Tuesday, and all of these things. And as God reveals the divine self, in fact, scholars, they call this the revelation of the divine personality, which I just think is funny. God isn't satisfied with just letting Moses see him. He walks past and he introduces himself and says, not just, here I am, whatever I am in Hebrew, but he says, I am the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, by visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generations. So God reveals, do you want to know what I'm about? Well, you already know I led you out of slavery when you had nothing to offer me. Last week, Ryan was talking about these treaties that they would do, covenants that would be made. In fact, the word in Hebrew that you would use for a covenant is you don't make it, you cut it. You cut a covenant, like how we would say you cut a deal. But it's because when you engrave those tablets that have the stipulations of the treaty, this is something that one party offers and another party offers as well. Obviously, there's one that's greater and one that's lesser. And the greater one is normally the one that is approached for this. Hey, we know you're more powerful. We know you're bigger and you have more money and more horses and your swords are sharper and all that. So how about we just work this out? But in Israel's case, it had nothing to offer God. It did not seek out God other than crying out to the Lord. It could not offer God anything. It had no house of worship. It had no land. It had no power. It didn't even have the autonomy in Exodus to go worship God out in the desert. They had to try to get Pharaoh to can you let us go for just a day or 3 days? It was constantly being negotiated and it didn't really happen. They didn't even have the right or the ability or the authority to worship God. So for God to make this covenant with them, this is a God that gives. This is a God that simply wants to see these living creatures, which we people are, living abundant lives. And what I find really interesting about this is a lot of people will ask questions like, well, God's slow to anger, and that's great, but it says that he'll visit the iniquity of the parents on the children. And I've actually seen people try to do some interesting mathematics, and they'll go through all of these famous people who have done bad things and try to find the bad things that happen to their kids afterwards and grandkids. And I'm like, I think you're missing the whole point of this. If you've ever seen an impressionist painting, if you get really close to it and you're trying to decipher each individual little point of paint, you will not see what the whole painting is about. Because they only function appropriately when you step back a little bit and look at them. And this is one of those scenarios. The Bible's not trying to tell us, all right, you can count generations. To this 1,000th generation, do you see how God is faithful? And do you see these people who weren't faithful? Make sure you tally up how God was angry with them for so many generations. It's actually far more general. God's saying, you know who I am? My anger is far outweighed by my mercy. My mercy and kindness, my loving faithfulness, far outweighs. Anytime that I do get angry, that I do say, all right, enough's enough, more times than not, I'm just still going to come back to you and be faithful, regardless of how angry you make me or how much you violate the covenant I just cut with you. The whole point of this is it's a comparison. God is faithful and merciful to the 1,000th generation. He's mad for a day or two. Now, he does get angry. He does hold people accountable, but God is saying that who I really am on the broad spectrum of things is I will choose love. I will choose mercy. I will choose forgiveness. And even when I do get angry and I hold people accountable because they've really screwed up, gosh, even that is still part of my love. And I think we can see that as we go through these commandments, how these really are a desire on God's part to see us living full, flourishing lives, not just as individuals, but how do we create a community that does this? And please, I have 3 children, so I am so used to and enjoy being interrupted. So if you have something that you're like, oh, we really should stop and talk about that, just say that, because otherwise I will just get really excited, and then I'll be like, isn't this amazing? Isn't this so much fun? And won't realize that people are like, oh, we should probably slow down. So if anyone has a question before we start this first commandment, or a thought, or expressions of joy, okay? You will have no other gods before me. Pretty simple. Now, oh, yes.
Does that imply there are other gods?
Oh, that's a great question. Does that imply there are other gods? It kind of seems like it, because if there weren't, then this wouldn't be an issue. I never tell my children to stay out of the ice cream when I leave if there's no ice cream in the freezer. That's not a thing. So there obviously are other gods in the world, in their lives and areas that are possible for them to worship. Yes, there are other gods. Now, the other question is this whole before me business. Does that mean like God just has to be the main God? Like he has to be number one, but you can have, sub-gods? Not really. Especially, and this is what I love about the commandments, they're self-interpreting. Now, I don't mean this interprets itself. All of the commandments, when taken together, when we look at the patterns and we look at how they explain and break things down, maybe this commandment doesn't say explicitly, you can't have any other gods at all. If we didn't get it here, we'd get it in the next one that says, you can't worship any other god but the Lord your God. So we do have to, I think, take that commandment is a commentary on this one. No other gods before me. Or what this could mean is, because the Hebrew uses the term before me is before my face. So it's almost like, I kind of feel like God is like a southern mama, and he's like, now don't let me catch you. I don't want to see it. Not meaning that it's okay to do it, but like that's how we say, I don't want to see you do that, meaning do not do that. Do not do that before my face. I don't want to see you worship another god. So don't do it. It's pretty simple. But here's the thing. Raise your hand if you've ever worshiped another god. I appreciate y'all's honesty. Thank you. Now, we'll hear people say things like, well, we make gods out of things like money and power and other human beings and things like that. Yeah, that's true. But this commandment, I think, is more than just worshiping another god. Because remember, it's not just prohibitive. What is it actually wanting you to do? Because if you're not worshiping other gods, why should you worship this one God alone? Well, because what is it that the Hebrew Shema, the great proclamation in Deuteronomy, says? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Now, what can one mean? It means a couple different things, right? What does one mean? It can mean singular. Oh, shoot. I thought singular was the first one. Or?
Or it can mean more than one in unity.
It can mean whole, right, unified. Yeah, so it can be whole. It can be singular, mean only. God is the only one. It can also mean God is whole. God cannot be divided. God cannot be broken up into parts. God can't be reduced. What's the other one? Like if I said number one is first. Well, guess what? In Hebrew, one means the same thing. Why is this not working? It means all three. Whole, first, singular. God is first. God is above all things. God is singular. God is the only God that you need to be worshiping. And God is really the only real God. You know, there's all kinds of gods that are wannabes, but not Yahweh. Yahweh is the only real God. But the one that this really gets at is that God is whole. God is one. So if you shall not have any other gods, that is reflective of God's own wholeness. It is because you can't worship a God of wholeness with a divided heart. Because in order to worship any God, you have to, in some sense, emulate that God. Think about like the worship of Dionysus in ancient Greece. Dionysus is the god of wine. Guess what people do to worship him? They drink wine. But if you're worshiping a God of wholeness with a divided heart, and you're worshiping another God on the side, you are never actually worshiping this God. Because you can only worship a God that is whole, that is unified, that is intact and undivided, while you are also whole and undivided. So this is incredibly important to know, because then it means not only should you have no other gods, all of you, all of yourself must be worshiping this God for it to be authentic worship. Bless you. This commandment is anchored in their own testimony. And this is another reason why, if it doesn't say explicitly that you can't have any other gods, period, that even if that whole before me ever gets in the way, God's reason for why they should have no other gods is because I'm the Lord your God, and I brought you out of Egypt. No other God brought you out of Egypt. So why would you worship a God that didn't break you out of bondage? That doesn't make any sense at all. So again, don't do it. You should worship, and you should want to worship the God that freed you, not a God that just happens to be there and kind of looks cool. There's got to be more reasons than that. And what I love about this is that Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, before these commandments show up, actually makes this case. He says, I know that the Lord is greater than all gods because he delivered the people from the Egyptians when the Egyptians dealt arrogantly with them. This was the witness. This was the testimony of God as the most sovereign, most powerful, almighty divine ruler. No other God rescued these people. So this God has to be greater because they were enslaved to a world superpower at the time that had money, that had power, that had armies. These people had nothing, and this God was able to get them out of Egypt. And guess what? The Egyptians just gave them silver and gold while they left. Just gave it to them. And people are like, if that's not testimony that this is the real God, why would you worship any God that didn't do this? If this was an option. So you can see the logic that all of this is building towards, right? This relationship with a God that so desired them and was able to perform something unheard of before on their behalf. Yes?
Also, God let them become slaves.
Ooh. Say more about that.
God is all powerful. God gives everyone free will. God couldn't prevent it before it ever happened.
Speaks to his sovereignty.
Well,
To me, that just gets into the whole thing. A lot of bad things happen to good people.
yeah.
The free will aspect of it. Not everybody is being directed by God's actions.
So, and you think about it, you have kind of this course of events where the children of Jacob saved from famine. And Joseph was placed there, was ahead of them. And yet they were then enslaved, only to be freed again. So is that, are all of those free will, or is this God allowing these things specifically to happen, kind of funneling things, so that his might, authority, omniscience can be demonstrated?
These are all really good questions, and for anyone who didn't hear, the question here is about how did the Israelites get into slavery in the first place? There's these possible options, and one of them is, well, God allowed this to happen. Or some would even go so far as to say it was God's will that it happened. And then other people might say, no, because God's will is for human beings and all of creation to flourish and live, because they are all God's creatures. So then what do we do with that? Well, this is where I have the most wonderful job in the world. I am a biblical scholar. That is not the same thing as a theologian. What we're talking about when we talk about God's will, free will, omnipotence, none of those things are in this text. Those are all constructs that we as human beings and as the church have made using the text. Now, if you tell me God is omnipotent and omniscient, I will show you 10 different passages that say the opposite. Because what these are is a collection of experiences people have had with God. So they're going to be different. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that good hard work of coming up with working theologies. All right, how do we think about God? How do we think about God based on this text? But what about another text? How do we think about this when the text says, God tells Moses, I have heard their groanings, and so I've decided to act. Well, when did you hear them? How long ago was that? What were you doing in the meantime? Okay, we are listening in on other people having these experiences with God, and we are believing that there is something for us to understand in order for us to have an experience with God as well. But that is not always going to be the same in every text. And in this particular text, this author is not concerned about whether God is omnipotent or God is omniscient. What this author is concerned about letting us know is that this God is a redeemer when other people, other powers are enslavers. And that this God, when this God acts, it will be on the part of setting free. It is distinguishing what God's power looks like and what Pharaoh's power looks like. God's power looks like setting people free. Pharaoh's power looks like exploiting people for his own benefit. Those are vastly different ways of using power. And what our biblical writer is saying is, not only are these really different, but God's power, oddly enough, is greater. The power of setting someone free is greater than the power and force you would have to take in order to enslave them. And that goes against a lot of human logic. So that's what I think we have to do in these situations, is we have to look at what is in front of us in this text. What is going on right here? And for a moment, we have to shelve all of those other things that we have been taught by the church and by thousands of years of Jewish and Christian theology that's been thinking about this. Because at the time, these are just people going through it. And the thinking about it came later. And we're getting the benefit of all of these stories and all of that thought about it. And so when we come to the text, we're coming back to that raw experience, coming back to that original experience of what was happening here. So that's my, I know this is going to terrify you. That was my short answer, if that's helpful. So now here is where I will say, this is where I love the fact that Scripture gives us a lot of different angles to look at things. So for instance, what we read in Exodus and a lot of Leviticus is actually there is commentary provided on those by probably my favorite book in the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy. Remember, it's two Greek words, deuteronomos, the second law. It's not a second law, like it's not a different one. It's a second reading. It's a revisiting the law. Okay, this is what I love about us, is that here we are, we're like, I just don't know about how to think about this thing. Well, guess what? Neither did they. So they wrote Deuteronomy because they're like, we should probably actually process some of these things about these commandments. And so a lot of commandments that you'll find in Exodus and Leviticus, you will find in Deuteronomy, but there's more written about them. It's almost like they're like, just so you know, here's a way to think about these things or clarify things that maybe you didn't get the last time we read this. From there, I love this. I love this because Deuteronomy at the very beginning says, guess what? You guys are going to screw up. When you go into this land, you're going to screw up. You're going to actually gamble everything that Yahweh has done for you. You will wind up once again under the power of a foreign ruler. And there you are again, and you will say, we better seek the Lord. And you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and soul. Do you hear that first commandment? You shall have no other gods. Why? Because you need to be giving your whole heart to this one God who gave everything to set you free. All your heart, all your soul. That's the only way that this covenant is going to work. The only way you can keep the first commandment, have no other gods but me, is by following this God with all your heart. So if we raised our hands and said, how many of us have broken the first commandment? It would be all of us. Even though we haven't gone and worshiped idols, we haven't joined another religion, all of us have had a divided heart. And yet, right in the beginning, God says, that's going to happen. It's going to be all right. Because what you'll do then is you'll come and seek me with all your heart. And then you'll find your way back. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your might. This, of course, is the commandment that Jesus said is the greatest commandment because it basically incorporates all of it. Now, what I love about this word soul, that's such a fuzzy word. I don't like it. That word soul is actually in that Genesis story. When God creates the human being and it becomes a living being, a living soul, it's the word nephesh. So it's with your whole life, with everything about you that is living, you should be loving the Lord your God with all your heart. So yes, when you're in your community, when you're with your neighbors, where all of these other commandments apply, that's also where you have to be loving your God with all your heart. It's your whole life. It's not where you go to church. It's not that you prayed a prayer 50 years ago when you walked an aisle in a Baptist church, although that's wonderful. That is not loving the Lord your God with all your heart. That is how we keep this first commandment. Then it gets added on to, not only do you need to love the Lord your God with all your heart, you need to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And then he says, if you will only heed this every commandment I am commanding you, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and all your soul. I love how Moses says this, if you would just do this, as if it's so trivial. If you could just love the Lord your God with all your heart, this would all be fine. But like I said, isn't it good news that God built into the plan? You will screw this up. You will be unfaithful. You will come to me with a divided heart and a divided mind. And guess what? We'll put you back together. There will be a way to make this right. Any questions, thoughts? Yes.
Someone that I love and treasure very deeply the problem with this God is that it's so exclusive. And she had a lot of friends who were from other religions. And she says the things that bugs me about this God is it excludes all the others. And she finds it too exclusive.
That's a really good question. And again, where I would go is let's look at the whole rest of it, because there are parts of the Bible that provide commentary on other parts. So one of my favorite parts that comments on all of these things is the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah says, now, while the law here might say that no eunuch can come into the temple or approach the tabernacle, actually, Isaiah says, I've heard from God pretty recently, and God actually says that those eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths and that do justice and that walk in my ways and are humble before me, those I will actually honor them with a name and a position. So we start seeing how this is definitely a call to wholeheartedness, to a following of God wholeheartedly. But that doesn't seem to make all of the exclusivity that human beings like to place on it, because Isaiah undoes a lot of that exclusivity. Well, no, actually, God is more than happy to have eunuchs welcomed into the temple, more than happy to have them join the congregation when they're the ones doing the justice. In fact, he flips the tables on them and says, if you think that just because you have kept all of the do not do's, if you didn't keep the here's what you should do and what the real goal is in mind, well, no, it wasn't Jesus, it was John the Baptist who said, you're lying to yourself. You can't say that you've got Abraham for your ancestor just because you've kept all of the do not rules. You actually had to do this thing. And that is something a little bit bigger and apparently a lot more inclusive. Now, I won't go so far as to say that there's no expectations, but this definitely seems far more inclusive because it's anyone with all their heart. Or so Isaiah tells us. I don't know him personally.
But it seems to me that lots of times when people are talking about you're excluding my God, that their God, it's like if you say Allah, that's the same God. They're just calling him a different name.
Yeah? What's interesting is God gives the Israelites his name. I am whatever I am,
Yep.
right? They don't call him that. They're like, no, we can't call him that name. That name is too holy. We're going to call him something else. Well, obviously, people have been calling God by whatever name they feel comfortable calling God for a really long time, including the people of God in the Old Testament. So, again, to that, I would say, I don't think anywhere here it says that that's how we're keeping the covenant, that you have to say my name like this. Again, I think a lot of that exclusivity is a lot of customs that have been built around this, but really when we think about it, the emphasis of keeping the covenant is on the verbs. Seek the Lord, love the Lord, serve the Lord. I don't think some of the things that we have filled it out with are necessarily the main thing. In fact, Jesus will talk about this, you've managed to keep the letter of this law and you've missed the point entirely. So I feel like we definitely can read it that same way, where you could read this and, like I said, think that, well, I've kept all these commandments. Or you can read it and think, oh, well, when I think about what the commandment is trying to do, maybe I haven't done that. And maybe that does violate God's plan or God's desire for what we do and what it looks like. Great questions. All right, this one's my favorite. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that's in heaven above, or that's on the earth beneath, or that's in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. Remember, we talked about this. But showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Well, he's going to prove this true because they're going to do this thing not too far in the future, and he's still going to be their God and love them. So obviously, he kept his end of the bargain. He loved a lot more than he punished, even though he did punish. Now, here's what's interesting. Whenever I ask people, what does this mean? What does it mean to make for yourself an image and bow down to it? What would you say? What does that mean? What's it referring to?
That's their God.
Sorry.
That's their God.
You're pointing to an image and saying, this is my God, okay? What do we call that? Idolatry, yes. Now, this is what's very interesting. They made this golden calf, right? What God is this? No. It's Yahweh. It's Yahweh. It's Yahweh. The prohibition is against all idols for sure, but the main prohibition in this is not making an idol of Yahweh. Do not make a representation of the invisible God. So, if you don't believe me, when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come make gods for us. Who shall go before us? For this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." So why are they scared? They don't have a leader, but more important, they don't have one they can see. We don't know where he is. So watch what happens. So all the people took off all the gold and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of the calf, and they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Now, if you think that that's ambiguous, keep reading. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it and made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to Yahweh." That word is Yahweh. This golden calf was their representation of the real true God. Now, if you have ever spent time on a dairy farm, you will know that that is not a good representation of God. Okay? We can already see a lot of plot holes in this, right? A lot of holes. But why? Why would they need to make this calf to represent the God of Israel? So they could see it. There's a problem with this. Oh, shoot, I thought that would be darker. All right, I don't know if you can see all of these. This is actually a Babylonian, it's a print of a Babylonian relief. And what's happening is the king and all of the folks, the entourage, are moving, and what they would do is they would put all their idols, all their gods, on these litters, and they would carry them with them into battle. Whenever the king went on a visit to another country, all of their idols, their gods, would go with them. Does this look familiar? Do you see how they're carrying thrones? And all the idols sit on the throne? Do you know what the top of the Ark of the Covenant is called? The mercy seat. It's a throne. This is Yahweh's throne that they carry with them, but there's no idol on it. And God said, "You're going to pack it up and carry it with you." And they're like, "Okay, this sounds totally familiar, but you're not putting anything on that seat. It's to remain empty because the God you serve is an invisible God. You can't make an image of Yahweh. You can carry around the throne to signify God's presence. You can know that God is there, but you are not to do one of these things." So you see how making any representation of Yahweh was a violation. Now, here's the question I get asked a lot. Well, why didn't God tell them how they should depict him? Because he already did. To make an image for yourself will always be to make it of yourself. This is why the prohibition exists. If cattle and horses or lions had hands and were able to draw with their feet and produce works which men do, horses would draw the forms of God like horses. If we make an image of God, we will always make it in our image. And didn't God already make God's own image? He made us. Exactly. I'll skip through these. These are all images of God. For some reason, it has stopped working. Let us make humankind in our image and according to our likeness. And so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. If you need to see the image of God, there you go. You already have it. So what's the real problem here then? If the Israelites needed to create another image of God. It's not just that they're doing what God prohibited, saying, don't make idols. What are they not doing by doing that? They are not acknowledging that they themselves and their neighbors are made in the image of God. Because to make it in my image is to reject it in yours. Is saying, this isn't good enough. All of you aren't good enough. God didn't know what God was doing when God made all of you. So we clearly have to make a cow. I know, right? I'm like, really? There was no other, like, there are so many more graceful animals, but I'm like, a cow? Like, that's amazing. Like, I wonder what was going on there. But it's a rejection of the divine image in the rest of humanity.
Do these things just carry over to paintings?
Okay, so that's a really great question. And the commandment here does give us a specification. You shall not bow down to it. Okay, you shall not make this image of God and use it as your focal point of worship. Now, for good reason, especially given the whole cow debacle, they sort of just instituted, all right, we're not making images of God, period. In fact, we won't even make images of Moses. We won't even make images of Elisha. And I think if someone asked me, is it wrong to make a picture of God? My husband is an artist, and he drew this absolutely beautiful graphite drawing of Jesus, like holding a baby lamb. It's the sweetest thing I've ever seen. I don't think he's going to hell for that. As long as you are not totalizing this, this is what God looks like. And anything other than this image cannot be. Now, I feel like making images of God in our own personal devotion or our imagination, I mean, I don't think we should throw out every picture book that kids have that has drawings of whatever people imagine God to be like. But is this what consumes your belief about who God is and therefore rules out what God can't be? Because if God looks like this, if the image of God looks just like this, then it can't be this. And we've seen how this plays out. The image of God has been thrown out for certain people. You can't be the image of God, you're a woman. You can't be the image of God, you're not the right color. Well, pretty sure that it just says humankind. Pretty sure that it was meant to be a little bit more inclusive, to return to our previous thing, than that. A cow actually kind of rules all of us out, don't you think? I'm like, nobody could be made in the image of God. I mean, unless someone is like, putting, hooves in their shoes and we don't all know about it. I think it's interesting that y'all are going to watch C.S. Lewis's story. He said this: my idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. God must continually work at the iconoclast, and every idea we form of him, he must in his mercy shatter. This is God being merciful by saying, stop thinking I look like this, and start looking around at the diversity, at the variety in your neighbors, in humanity, in creation, and then you might actually start learning something about who God actually is. That will tell you far more. The fact that God is being depicted by all of us here now tells us something about God. Even if it doesn't give us like this carbon print, it doesn't give us a photograph, it tells us far more about God's character and nature than any image or any cow could ever do. I just realized I have no idea what time it is. Oh, snap. Okay, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it was already 7 o'clock, and we didn't even make it to the third commandment. All right, well, that'll just be something more for us to do next week. Any final thoughts, questions, expressions of joy?
I just thought about when you're walking in the woods, you see the clouds or between the trees, a kind of nice something to look at. It gives you that feeling from, this is God. This is God's creation.
Mm-hmm.
And at least what you're just saying, I'm just feeling like that's also like seeing who God is, the image of God, by looking at His creation.
Yes.
That's the thought of this.
Yes. In fact, one of the people I was having dinner with tonight, I was telling a story about my son. And they said, oh, we can tell that he's your son. I don't remember what I said he did. You can tell something about what I've made. And you can tell something about me from it. And aren't we all God's kids? Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you guys next week.